Here is another popular recording from that era, the duo of Collins and Harlan performing Row, Row, Row on a 1913 Edison blue amberol cylinder.
Young Johnny Jones, he had a cute little boat, and all the girlies he would take for a blow. He had girlies on the shore, sweet little peaches by the score. But Johnny was a Weisenheimer, you know. His steady girl was slow, and every Sunday afternoon he'd jump in his boat and they would spoon, and then he'd row, row, row. Way up the river he would row, row, row. A hug he'd give her, then he'd kiss her now and then. She would tell him when. He'd fool around, and then they'd kiss again, and then he'd row, row, row. A little further he would row, oh, 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 oh. Then he'd drop both his oars, take a few more encores, and then he'd row, row, row. Right in his boat he had a cute little seat, and every kiss he stole from Flo was so sweet. And he knew just how to row. He was a rowing Romeo. He knew an island where the trees were so grand. He knew just where to land. Them tales of love he'd tell to Flo until it was time for them to go. And then he'd row, row, row. Way up the river he would row, row, row. A hug he'd give her, then he'd kiss her now and then. She would tell him when. He'd fool around, and then they'd kiss again, and then he'd row, row, row. A little further he would row, oh, 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 oh. Then he'd drop both his oars, take a few more encores, and then he'd row, row, row. Row, row, row. Way up the river he would row, row, row. A hug he'd give her, then he'd kiss her now and then. She would tell him when. He'd fool around, and then they'd kiss again, and then he'd row, row, row. A little further he would row, oh, 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 oh. Then he'd drop both his oars, take a few more encores, and then he'd row, row, row.
Recreated speeches, explanatory talks, and comic sketches were also released as Edison records, but their popularity was limited. Harry E. Humphrey recorded many such recitation records, including this version of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address on an Edison celluloid cylinder of 1913.
"47 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
In 1912, Edison developed a method for molding celluloid plastic cylinder records. A blue dye was added to the celluloid for eye appeal and to distinguish them from the earlier black wax amberol 4-minute records. However, the plaster of Paris core used to support the thin celluloid shell tended to warp the records, which caused a low-frequency rumbling sound. Edison had a broad sense of humor throughout his life. Here he is telling a joke called The Liver Story, recorded privately at the Edison Company at about the time the blue amberol celluloid cylinders were first introduced.
Say, Walter Miller, did you ever hear this story of this California story? About 25 years ago, a man from Boston who was a furniture dealer had a very bad case of liver complaint. So he went to California and rigged out a team and started down the San Joaquin Valley with the idea of testing all the mineral springs that were in that valley so that it might relieve him of the terrible pains he had from his liver complaint. Well, he traveled down the valley for the whole summer and he had no relief. But towards the end of the valley, he came to a spring and it immediately relieved him of his pain. Well, he was a very wealthy man, so he started a sanitarium and sent searchers all over the world, and by and by there were people who came from all parts of the world and stayed at the sanitarium, and their liver complaint was cured and they were relieved of their pain. Well, about 20 years afterwards, the man died. And at the coroner's inquest, they had to take his liver out and kill it with a club.
Although we can't be absolutely certain, a cylinder record in the Edison collection is marked Piano Solo, Edison, 1915. As you can tell from even this poor recording, the great inventor was not much of a piano player. We can't even blame this on hearing loss, however, for he auditioned countless recording artists even into the 1920s. Theodore Roosevelt was a great American president, and several Edison cylinders containing his speeches were released. The optimism of the ideas of social reform of the early 20th century are evident in this speech called Social and Industrial Justice, which was released on blue amberol cylinder in 1919.
Our prime concern is that in dealing with the fundamental law of the land, in assuming finally to interpret it and therefore finally to make it, the acts of the courts should be subject to and not above the final control of the people as a whole. I deny that the American people have surrendered to any set of men, no matter what their position or their character, the final right to determine those fundamental questions upon which free self-government ultimately depends. The people themselves must be the ultimate makers of their own constitution. And where their agents differ in their interpretations of the Constitution, the people themselves should be given the chance, after full and deliberate judgment, authoritatively to settle what interpretation it is that their representatives shall thereafter adopt as binding. We do not question the general honesty of the courts, but in applying to present-day social conditions the general prohibitions that were intended originally as safeguards to the citizen against the arbitrary power of government in the hands of caste and privilege, these prohibitions have been turned by the courts from safeguards against political and social privilege into barriers against political and social justice and advancement. Our purpose is not to impugn the courts, but to emancipate them from a position where they stand in the way of social justice, and to emancipate the people in an orderly way from the iniquity of enforced submission to a doctrine which would turn constitutional provisions which were intended to favor social justice and advancement into prohibitions against such justice and advancement. In the last 20 years, an increasing percentage of our people have come to depend on industry for their livelihood, so that today the wage workers in industry rank in importance side by side with the tillers of the soil. As a people, we cannot afford to let any group of citizens or any individual citizen live or labor under conditions which are injurious to the common welfare. Industry, therefore, must submit to such public regulation as will make it a means of life and health, not of death or inefficiency. We must protect the crushable elements at the base of our present industrial structure. We stand for a living wage. Wages are subnormal if they fail to provide a living for those who devote their time and energy to industrial occupations. The monetary equivalent of a living wage varies according to local conditions, but must include enough to secure the elements of a normal standard of living, a standard high enough to make morality possible, to provide for education and recreation, to care for immature members of the family, to maintain the family during periods of sickness, and to permit of reasonable saving for old age. Hours are excessive if they fail to afford the worker sufficient time to recuperate and return to his work thoroughly refreshed. We hold the night work of labor and women, that the night labor of women and children is abnormal and should be prohibited. We hold that the employment of women over 48 hours per week is abnormal and should be prohibited. We hold the 7-day working week is abnormal, and we hold that 1 day of rest in 7 should be provided by law. We hold that the continuous industries operating 24 hours out of 24 are abnormal, where because of public necessity or for technical reasons, such as molten metal, the 24 hours must be divided into 2 shifts of 12 hours or 3 shifts of 8. They should, by law, be divided into 3 of 8.
The diamond disc record, introduced by Edison in 1913, was his first attempt at the disc format, using a hard plastic-like material for the record and a diamond point for the playing needle, hence the name. The Edison disc offered high-quality reproduction and long life. At 80 RPM and with vertical modulation, however, the Edison discs were not playable on competitors' machines, and so a complete line of diamond disc phonographs had to be introduced. This post-war message from Edison praising the efforts of the Allied troops was recorded on an Edison diamond disc in 1919. Edison also had aided the war efforts and was a member of the Naval Consulting Board, which sought new technological weapons and defenses during World War I.
Edison speaking. Our boys made good in France. The word American has a new meaning in Europe. Our soldiers have made it mean courage, generosity, self-restraint, and modesty. We are proud of the North Americans who risked their lives for the liberty of the world. But we must not forget, and we must not permit demagogues to belittle the part played by our gallant allies. Their casualty lists tell the story. However proud we may be of our own achievements, let us remember always that the war could not have been won if the Belgians, the British, the French, and the Italians had not fought like bulldogs in the face of overwhelming odds. The Great War will live vividly in the minds of Americans for the next 100 years. I hope that when we do reverence to the memory of our brave boys who fell in France, we shall not forget that their brothers in arms who wore the uniform of our allies. I believe that the national airs of France, Great Britain, Italy, and Belgium should for all time to come be as familiar to us as our own Star-Spangled Banner.
Released on Edison Diamond Disc in 1928 was the snappy foxtrot, I Want to Be Loved by You, from the Broadway show Good Boy. The Green Brothers Novelty Band recorded several sides on the Edison label during the late 1920s. Edison's last effort in sound recording came late in the 1920s with the release of standard format 78 RPM records. These records were made with electrical recording techniques and intended for phonographs using either electrical or acoustical playback. These recordings were discontinued in October of 1929, the month of the stock market crash, and marked the end of the Edison Company's phonograph division. Very few of these Edison electrical recordings were made, and even fewer were ever distributed and sold. This recognizable tune is a good example of these late Edison records.
By the window, that is where I'll be. Come tiptoe through the tulips with me. Tiptoe from your pillow to the shadow of a willow tree, and tiptoe through the tulips with me. Knee-deep in flowers we'll stray, we'll keep the showers away. And if I kiss you in the garden, in the moonlight, will you pardon me? Come tiptoe through the tulips with me.